Mass media of its day was a major contributor to the rift that caused the American Civil War. If they could do it once, could they do it again? Now, obviously, not all of media was complicit, and not all of it was actually gearing itself towards causing a civil war, but there were a lot of contributors. First, to understand media of the day, we had pamphleteering, which was both done in person and facilitated by the U.S. mail system. Uh, we had posting broadsides, basically tacking 8 by 11 uh, posters up to walls, get the word out. Uh, we had newspapers, we had books. Now, one of the big things at the time is books, because it had less competition, uh, and books weren't published in nearly the amount that they are now. A single book could have a lot more ability to carry an audience than it would now. Although, in terms of gross sales, many books now would completely swamp what they were putting out then. But if you look at it in terms of size of the population at the time and per capita, a book could have massive influence. We also have to understand that the newspapers of the day, uh, there was literally no attempt to hide bias at all. Uh, Typically, newspapers were the mouthpieces of the political parties, and they made little effort to hide what their viewpoint was. And typically, and you still see some remnants of this in some of the names of the older newspapers, where you might see a paper called like the Daily Democrat or something like that. And literally, it was the party, the Democratic Party's paper of that area. So one feature, do we kind of understand the mindset of the people of the time? Definitely, there. If let's talk like 1840s, before things really start getting out of hand. So in the South, we have a system that's kind of critical to their economy. They really uh, can't conceive of a way of coming up with a new system that would take over and do better. So any threat to it is seen as the, the equivalent of taking away their livelihood and taking away the livelihood they plan on passing along to their children. Um, so it's viewed upon the same way as if someone were to say, "Hey, tomorrow we're going to ban an entire profession. All computer programmers will no longer be able to be programmers." That's kind of the way that's kind of the impact. Now, another issue that was big in the South that was poorly understood up north, and this is very important, is the idea of slave uprisings. There were a handful, they're probably, if you look, Wikipedia actually documents a bunch of them. Some of them are pretty small, some of them got to be sizable. But the typical result of a slave uprising was pretty horrific, because the slaves realized that if they weren't able to turn it into some kind of grand rebellion, that they are all going to pay for it with their lives. And so typically these little slave rebellions were brutal, where uh, they would kill their owners, and if and probably some of the more loyal slaves who were kind of close to the family, and if it started spreading out to the other uh, family steads, uh, yeah, it would get kind of brutal. Now, so there was a kind of a deep dread, horror, and fear in the South over these slave rebellions. So they made every effort to try to stop them before they even started, and uh, there was nothing comparable in the North in terms of fear. Something that was something that was uh, the worst thing you can imagine. So essentially, the South had their economic interest at stake. Initially, it was kind of interesting because the South kind of believed that slavery was probably going to die off on its own as well until the cotton gin came along and made slavery more profitable. Uh, then, for a while, the South was content with the idea of slavery being where it was at. And then, as they got more paranoid about things because of media, they started demanding slavery be allowed to spread in order to try to keep the equilibrium that had been going on in the Senate. Now, in the North, the typical outlook up there was that it was just something they'd grown up with. They were born with it somewhere in the country. They knew it was there, and the general sense of things was, well, in a couple generations it'll be gone. We don't need to push it. We don't need to hurry it, but we don't need to agitate the South either. And we're willing to work out compromises whenever they get their feathers ruffled in order to keep the nation together. All's well. So some of the early agitation comes in the form of pamphleteering through the mail system. And there are some interesting problems that popped up where, like, the South was attempting to uh, allow uh, for the blockage of objectionable materials being sent through the mail, and some local officials took it upon themselves to actually go through the mail to remove this material so it couldn't be spread in their areas. But probably the biggest mass media event that happens is when Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, I guess it's easiest to describe the general outlay of the book. So, she had never actually been down south where slavery was. She may have seen some little, because slavery was still acceptable up in the north to a certain extent, much smaller groups, and in many cases it was currently in the process of being grandfathered out. So she'd never actually saw the system she was writing about. Now, she did claim that she did interview numerous runaway slaves in order to come up with an idea of what slavery looked like. Now, assuming this is accurate, and we don't really, because if you think about it, it's kind of, it sounds questionable that she would do this. Um, First, that a woman would be mixing with men of any kind at that time and interviewing them and getting their points of view seems a little questionable in the idea that a white woman would be mixing with black men and getting their stories even more so. But I mean, let's say it did happen. Okay, so they're runaways. So it means they were probably, okay, um, fleeing slavery was dangerous. It was, so the where you were had to be so awful that you were willing to risk potentially uh, being beaten and tortured for trying to escape, possibly getting killed for trying to escape. The outcome was not going to be good. So your local situation had to have been pretty bad for you to flee. And obviously, it couldn't have been that bad for everybody because otherwise, all the slaves would have attempted to flee at some point. For some of them, the situation obviously wasn't good, but they said, well, it's not worth getting beaten over trying to make a run for it. But obviously, the people who did flee probably came from the worst situations there were. So if Harriet did build a composite from runaway slaves, she was building a composite of the absolute worst situations of slavery. Uh, Things that are depicted in her book, but they're very couched, the terminology. So it's there's it's inferred in a way. And then she kind of says, now let your imagination run. So there are stories, she talks about the female slaves being sexually abused by their owners, beatings, overworking, all that kind of stuff. And be true, okay, all those things did happen, and there were probably instances where you had plantations or owners who did all those things, but it probably wasn't across the entire system that way. If it was, you probably would have had a lot more uprisings, you had a lot more runaways, the system probably would have been untenable. No, not to, you know, not to say that slavery isn't awful, even if it's in its kindest form. I mean, when you make somebody labor and they don't get the benefit of their labor, that's horrible. When a person can't control their own future, that's horrible. When a person can't plan for or alter the future of their children, that's a crime. Uh, the things that Harriet would talk about just made it far worse. So, people today would probably say, "Oh, geez, wouldn't there be like a if you're trying to report on a particular instance, wouldn't you do investigation and get both sides of the story and bring it all together and give us a balanced view?" Well, just like clickbait and rage bait and all the other stuff we do today, human nature hasn't changed at all. I mean, if a book came out that just basically laid out slavery the way it was, it wouldn't be very titillating. It wouldn't be very sensational. Harriet's book was sensational at the time. Even though a lot of the things were inferred, people had pretty good imaginations and they could say, oh boy, this is awful. And the interesting thing is her book would end up creating kind of this cottage industry where whoever could come up with the most lurid tales of what would happen during slavery uh, basically could make bestsellers. So understand her motivations. One, yes, it is a work of fiction, but she was passing it off as a representation of what was actually happening. And so, in the minds of Northerners who saw this and read this, they'd say, wow, that's how all slavery is. And so it did start turning public opinion against it. Not enough to completely change things, but what it sets the stage for what would come next. And Harriet herself would say her goal was to, it was meant as a propaganda piece before the term propaganda was really used. She meant to change the minds of people in the North, and she meant to shame the people of the South into changing their ways. So you have this fairly big change in the North. Probably not to a full majority. So there's probably now more abolitionists than there were before, and people who were on the fence saying, yeah, this needs to end at some point, and other people saying, yeah, it can't spread anymore. So it did create, it started upsetting the apple cart of compromise that had essentially carried everything forward up until this point. Uh, One of the things that starts altering things worse in Europe, 1848 time period, we have the revolutions of Europe. Overwhelmingly they fail. They do cause social change there, but not as much as a lot of the revolutionaries want. A lot of the revolutionaries from these failed revolutions come to America. A lot of them from Germany, some from a little further Eastern Europe. And these new German immigrants did not grow up with slavery. So they're not like Americans who've been here for several generations where they just, oh yeah, it's here, and yeah, it's awful, but what are you going to do about it? In a couple generations it'll be gone. They come in fresh going, this is awful, this can't stand, this can't be allowed to do what it's doing. And so what ends up happening is they begin the process of changing political and public opinion in such a way where the Whig Party is no longer tenable. And essentially, we have a whole bunch of new parties form up. Eventually, the Republicans, but we also have the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, a few others that pop up in there, and overwhelmingly, they're very anti slavery. And each one of them creates their own newspapers. Now, the newspapers of the time, of course, are starting to copy what they see in the best selling books. Especially if you're a new upstart paper, well, you're going to print the most sensationalist stuff possible. And so if you're going to exaggerate or fabricate, that's acceptable on a certain level. And so you start seeing this rise and kind of more and more anti-slavery stuff popping up in the northern newspapers. Now, by any stretch, it's not the majority, because the Democratic Party is still strong up there, and they're not going to allow that kind of sentiment in their newspapers. And obviously, some of the party's papers want to be respectable, so they're going to try to avoid sensationalism, but there's ones who are going to grab onto it. Now, what do you suppose happens when these sensationalist papers are printing stuff that's, pretty awful in terms of talking about slavery, saying horrible things about the slave owners, and in fact, at some points, even saying that they may all have to die in order for slavery to go away, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Well, that's just in the North, isn't it? But it doesn't stay there. See, one of the things that was going on was there were various clipping services which would clip newspapers and then send them to other parts of the country, because newspapers were just as lazy then as they were now. So much easier to just take somebody else's story and print it in your paper than to have writers filling out the entire thing. So if the South were just like the North and they loved a little bit of sensationalism, what kind of stuff would they print? Well, they'd print the most sensationalist stuff from the North about things talking about, yes, slave owners need to die. Well, if you were a Southern newspaper and you printed this in your paper and your paper sold like hotcakes, other people would probably kind of start adopting it. So the Southern newspapers started picking up on all this lurid, sensational stuff from the North, saying, hey, look what this Northern paper printed. Hey, look what this Northern paper printed. And it created the illusion that the North had just become completely unhinged in terms of how they viewed the South. And this created kind of a fortress mentality in the South, where they became more and more defensive of the institution of slavery and got politically freaked out over things that were fairly minor. Okay, so move forward to the great John Brown raid at Harper's Ferry. Now, John Brown was completely out of his fucking mind. His idea was his sons, and a bunch of followers, they talked a bunch of northern East Coast liberals into giving them money, and they said, essentially, we want this money, and we're going to do something with it, and it's best if we don't tell you what we're going to do with it. And people gave him money. So he put this expedition together, and they crossed into Virginia at Harper's Ferry, which had a federal arsenal there. And their goal was to take over the federal arsenal and then send runners out to the closest plantations to let them know that the great uprising had begun. And then they were going to dole out the guns to all the local slaves, and then trigger a rebellion that would spread across the entire South. Now, here's where that disconnect between the North and the South in terms of slave uprisings needs to be understood. In the South, a slave uprising means all of us die. In the North, they kind of looked at it in a romanticized sort of way, kind of like, oh, it's kind of like the American Revolution, where, yes, a few people die here and there, and then in the end, liberty comes out. So they didn't view this exactly the same way. John Brown's attempt fails miserably. He ends up getting hanged along with most of his sons. I think a few of them ended up walking. But what ends up happening in the North, and it's you can see a lot of stuff online where they talk. A lot of the newspaper articles were captured for that time period, talking about what happened to John Brown. And in terms of the editorial pieces, probably a good chunk of the northern papers are not favorable to John Brown. Most of them are saying, yeah, he was a criminal, and maybe they'll say, yeah, we understood what he was trying to do, but that's not the way to go about it. Some of them, especially the Democratic papers, just said outright, good riddance, hurrah, he's been hung. However, in the more radical papers, they were painting him up as a martyr, and they're basically saying, yes, what he was doing should have succeeded. Yes, we know what at least in the radical papers, we know what happens in the slave uprising, and if all the white people in the South have to die in order for slavery to end, so be it. Well, did the South go and say, oh, let's take a proper sampling of these articles to get a feel for what the actual picture is in the North? No, they wanted to sensationalize it, so they grabbed the most sensational pieces and played it out, and the South was absolutely horrified because in their mind, they're like, okay, well, the North, there's people in the North who really want us dead, and just our feel for it seems like most of them. So when we get around to the Republican Party forming, we have an instance where the Republican Party was almost entirely a party of the North. There was virtually no Republican Party in what would be eventually become the border states, and there was definitely no Republican Party hardly at all in the South. Understanding how elections worked at the time, essentially what would happen is during an election, your party would show up at the polling station, and they would have ballots. And your party would say, hey, here's who's running for this, here's who's running for that, put your mark on the ballot, etc., and they keep track of it. If you didn't have party organization in an area, you didn't even have a ballot. So you had areas that barely even heard of the Republican Party at this point. And the other areas in the South were like, okay, yeah, they're very tiny compared to what the Democratic Party is. People did sense that there was something kind of unwholesome coming in the election. And the Southern papers tended to paint the Republican Party as far more radical than it was. And then, of course, the radical papers in the North gave them the ammunition to make this seem true. Now, the papers in the South weren't trying to foment a split. They were trying to sell papers. Not all of them. Obviously, there were papers who were responsible and tried to give a balanced view of things, just as there was in the North. But all it takes is a small radical element in both sides, one to create and the other to feed, in order to create this problem. So then in 1860, when the Republican Party ends up winning with Lincoln, the South is horrified. On one hand, they're completely shocked at this king because based on how they looked, it's like, well, I didn't see any Republican Party at the election. Who are these guys? And then when they asked, who are these guys? Well, their papers happily told them, oh, these are crazy people who want you dead. Huh. So a lot of people will say, well, gee, if you look at Lincoln's actual views of slavery and that the Republicans weren't nearly as radical as they were, your reaction would be, well, the South completely freaked out over the Republicans getting elected. Why did they secede? Well, they seceded because their papers told them that the Republicans were crazy people who wanted them all dead. Not just crazy people who wanted slavery to end, not people who wanted slavery to end sometime in the future, crazy people who want you dead now. Does the Civil War make more sense to you all of a sudden? Do you see elements of our media doing anything similar now? Has human behavior changed to where we can completely resist sensationalism over balanced reporting? Well, I hope this gives you a little bit of food for thought. If you like the video, please like it. If you have some comments, please comment. And if you think you know somebody who would like this, please share it with them. I appreciate you spending time with me tonight. Hopefully I'll see you soon in a new video.